Then the tax collector, they have their question. Tax collectors came to be baptized and said to him, "Teacher, what shall we do?" And John says to them, "Collect no more than what is appointed for you." You have your job. It's not a very popular one. You're supposed to collect the taxes from the people, and the taxes may indeed be oppressive, but you add to the oppression by clipping the coin and taking a little extra for yourself and lining your own pockets by virtue of your authority as a tax collector. What's John saying to them? He's saying, stop stealing. You're stealing from people. Paul tells us in his epistles, let him who steals steal no more. So one of the fruits of conversion, beloved, is you don't steal. I remember when I was in 9th grade and played basketball at our junior high school, we had basketball practice every afternoon, and we had combination locks on our lockers, at least most of the guys did. One poor soul didn't, and one day after practice he came in and discovered that his watch and other valuables, his wallet, had been stolen. And I remember, not a Christian, a pagan, thinking at that time, how can anybody be that selfish, that self-centered? How can they look in the mirror and know that they've actually reached into somebody else's locker and taken for themselves that which belongs to somebody else? Can you imagine that? How immoral that is. You can't be converted and be a thief. But we're more sophisticated about it. We don't just go into our neighbor's house and take their possessions. We use the ballot to do it. We steal from our neighbors and let the government do it so it's legal. If you've ever voted for a tax on your neighbor that you didn't vote on yourself, you stole from your neighbor. Do you realize that? Alexis de Tocqueville said centuries ago when he observed the American experiment, he said, what will kill America is in the first place when people realize they can vote for themselves largesse from the government, where they can ask the government to take somebody else's property and give it to them. It's theft. It's legal theft, but it's theft nevertheless. Or he said when people realize that the ballot is worth money. He said, no civilization can survive for long with that kind of a culture built on legal thievery. Well, then the soldiers asked their question. And they said, what should we do? John said to them, don't intimidate anyone or accuse them falsely, and be content with your wages. Yesterday, Vesta and I were driving down one of the streets in Altamont Springs, and a police car from Altamont Police Department pulled alongside of us. Fortunately, he didn't have his red light on. But I looked over and I strained my neck to see if it was one of our church members who's an officer with the Altamont Police Department. I couldn't really tell, but the policeman in the car looked very nice in his fabulous uniform. And you know how soldiers look when they're all dressed up in their dress blues and so on, and the policemen with their spit and polish uniforms. They can be scary. They can be intimidating. And they can use the power and the force of their office to falsely accuse people. But John the Baptist was doing the Mirandizing before it was even fashionable in the United States. He says, don't use your office to intimidate or to extort people or to accuse them falsely. And oh, by the way, another fruit of the conversion is to be content with your wages. Content with my wages. Now John's not preaching, he's meddling. People aren't always content with their wages, and when we're not content, we have a tendency to shake our fists in the face of God, saying, God, you and your providence have not been kind enough to us. If you were really a good God, you would make us more prosperous than we are. It seems like John here was pretty much covering the gamut, but we're not done yet. After he had the discussion with them as to whether or not he was Jesus or the Messiah, which we'll look at, God willing, next week, we're told almost as a footnote at the end that John was shut up in prison. Why? Why did Herod shut him up in prison and subsequently kill him by cutting off his head? Let me tell you why. Because John, following a long list of prophets of God, was engaged with what we call in theology prophetic criticism. He had the audacity publicly to criticize the tetrarch, the ruler of that territory, Herod, for his illicit marriage to his daughter-in-law. And so John the Baptist called him out publicly. Now, recently a man came to me with a question no one had ever asked me before. He said, R.C., who are you going to tell the folks at St. Andrews to vote for in the next presidential election? I did a double take. I said, hey, I've never told my congregation ever who they should vote for in a presidential election. He said, why not? You're their shepherd. Don't you care about how they express their Christian faith in government elections? I said, yes, actually I do. Well, I know that we're told that we're not supposed to do that, and if we do, we might run afoul of the government, and we're told that there's supposed to be this wall of separation between church and state that, of course, the Constitution knows nothing about. But that wall seems to have only one side. The government doesn't like it if we criticize it openly. That they don't hesitate to tell the church what they're not allowed to preach about. They don't hesitate to enforce their views of abortion on Christian institutions, as we've seen in recent weeks. No wall of separation there. They don't hesitate to tell parents in Texas what their mothers are allowed to put in their children's lunch bags when they go to school. Well, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. And the main reason I'm not going to tell you who to vote for is because I don't know who I'm going to vote for myself. And if I ever discern that before November, I might tell you who I think you ought to vote for. But I'll do this. I'll tell you who not to vote for. You can't vote for any candidate who supports abortion on demand. Any candidate in any party. Suppose one of the people who are running for the presidency of the United States in this next election adopted a platform that they wanted to reinstitute slavery in this country. Would you vote for him? I sure hope not. You realize that when unethical and immoral customs become entrenched in a culture, it's almost impossible to excise them. Think of what William Wilberforce went through in England, trying to get the abolition of slavery in his nation, where he was defeated time after time after time by the Parliament of England, until finally enough consciences were aroused that England did what was right and abolished the institution of slavery. Think what it cost the United States to get rid of slavery. 800,000 American lives. And abortion on demand is far more wicked than slavery. And the present administration in Washington, D.C. is totally committed to continuing the process of abortion on demand and even partial birth abortion. They are embarked on an economic policy that is altogether destructive to the people of this country. This nation has had the greatest prosperity of any nation in the history of the world. And it's being systematically destroyed. The last time I heard that 51% of the people in America who are working do not pay any income tax. Justice for all? What's their fair share? You don't hear about that. But that's 51% of the people that want to keep the present administration in office. They're buying their vote. But here's the real tragedy. Those 51%, dear people, are not paying any income tax because they're not prospering. And the main reason they're not prospering is because everything that produces production, employment, and prosperity in this country is being attacked by the present administration. If you care for the poor, and particularly if you care for your African American friends who are being systematically kept off the upper ranks of the economic ladder by this administration, you've got to vote against them. And you got to vote against them with gusto. Now, don't take this as a manifest for the Republican Party, because I see the difference between Republicans and Democrats in America as a difference in degree and not of kind. I don't see any party really committed to just economic policies, to just taxation policies, or to morality of the sanctity of life. Now you say, what in the world are you talking about that from the pulpit for? We're not supposed to be discussing politics. Yes, we are. Let me tell you why. The office of the preacher, the office of prophetic criticism, it goes through the whole of sacred Scripture, beginning when Moses went up and knocked on the door of Pharaoh and said, God told me to tell you to let my people go, because what you've done in your government of Egypt is wrong. And Moses was God's prophetic voice to Pharaoh, as Elijah was to Ahab and his consort, who were trying to impose paganism on the house of Israel. Or Isaiah, as he went before the kings, calling them to repentance, as Nathan confronted David in his sin, which was a sin not just against Uriah, but against the nation. He ruled. Or think of Daniel, Ezekiel, challenging the kings of Babylon for their evil. All the way through the history of the church, it has been the function of the church not to be the state, but to be the conscience of the state. God establishes government for the main reason, originally, of sustaining, protecting, and maintaining the sanctity of human life. And when a government, any government, fails to do that, it has been demonized. And it is the responsibility of the church to stand up to that government and say, stop it! To scream bloody murder. And to say, we won't tolerate you people who have no more regard for human life or ethics. This kind of corruption will destroy this people and all of our institutions with it. Again, it is not the duty of the church to be the state, but it is the duty of the state to be the state. And when we speak to the state about abortion, we're not asking the state to be the church, we're asking the state to be the state. To do what they're held accountable by God to do, protect human life. This isn't Russia. This isn't the Third Reich. This is the United States of America that kills and sanctions the killing of 1.5 million babies every year. And where is the church? Intimidated, terrified, cringing. Before the first service this morning, somebody asked me, who had just finished reading The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He said, R.C., he said, have you ever read that book? I said, yes, of course. He said, I read it, he said, and I couldn't understand why you hadn't written the foreword to it. He said, you write the foreword to everything else. I said, actually, I didn't even know how to write when Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote that book and paid for it with his life. Because while the rest of the German churches were intimidated, Dietrich Bonhoeffer said to Adolf Hitler, no, you have to go. And your administration, in the name of God. He who has ears to hear what John the Baptist says, he said not only to first century Jews, he says to us this morning, let him hear.